I want to bring you something we've been working on today as we looked over everything that's been happening across our country over this past weekend. Sometimes there's so many different images, it can be hard to understand what's really happening. So I want to go into the fundamentals of this moment, and I hope you stay with me. So we're going to try to do a few things here, from looking at the latest on the ground to looking at the seeds of these issues in history in this report. Now, there's no single image or clip or quote that can capture everything going down right now, but we can begin with scenes from this weekend that depict the turmoil that's permeating our whole nation right now and some of the emerging voices that could define this moment. Please keep in mind, as I show you this next clip, this series of clips, really, that some of what you're about to see can indeed be disturbing.
I watched a white officer assassinate a black man, and I know that tore your heart out.
Charge the cops. Charge all the cops.
Oh, no, 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 no.
So sad.
I share the outrage, and I stand with the protesters.
Charge them in every city across America where our people are being murdered.
We see several officers go up to the car and start breaking the glass.
Now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize.
Mobilize. We want you to know, as we report the facts here, altogether, we've seen that mobilization, protests in at least 140 cities, continuing right now tonight as the president prepares to speak. Now, many of these are primarily peaceful in nature, some turned to looting and violence. Authorities have made over 4,000 arrests to date, and this is not over. Officials also counting several people who've died in these protests. Now, in a movement confronting police misconduct, also these allegations of misconduct in the protests themselves. A video that has circulated of officers escalating and initiating contact. This footage of NYPD appearing to make a decision to drive into a crowd of civilians. That's now under investigation. So as this all piles up, many are asking right now, how did we get here? The short answer is as depressing as it is enraging. We have been here in this position for a long time. When a society is fundamentally unjust, its injustices build and fortify themselves over time. New developments that occur can routinely then flow into the existing systems. So take these three flashpoints right now: the police, the economy, and the pandemic. Well, the first two operate on years of inequality. The third, this coronavirus, of course, arrived as a new phenomenon, but it swiftly ground its way through old inequalities: American housing, healthcare, and economics, all unequal. And that swiftly turned this technically blind virus into a discriminating killer. Black Americans dying at roughly triple the rate of white Americans right now from it. The economy reinforcing the dynamic. We can all see that tens of millions of jobs were just eliminated from the virus shutdown. It's obviously not the workers' fault. So I ask you tonight, can we also see that black workers are almost twice as likely to be laid off during the pandemic? And while, yes, everyone may be feeling the recession in different ways, I ask you tonight to look at this. Can we also see that while 17% of white-owned businesses face a decline in this pandemic, the number is more than double that for black-owned businesses? And months into this, I have another question. Can we also see that Congress has taken your money for pandemic relief, and while some of it did go to health care and unemployment insurance, a significant majority of the $454 billion in relief bills have benefited large corporations with these huge payoffs with very little accountability. And the 1% is profiting right now as people go hungry. And March tonight, billionaires have grown $434 billion richer in the pandemic. Hundreds of billions. So as we try to understand all this as it keeps going, protesters know about these facts I'm telling you. You know about these facts. People know where the money goes. People know how the powerful reward themselves and control capital. And as we have a larger debate about a reopening staffed by essential workers, who of course do essential labor, can we address the fact that they find their treatment by corporations and the government to be anything but essential? And that's why this is also a night to study and listen to people who've been pressing these injustices long before they took over the headlines or shut down our streets.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
Toni Morrison speaking to America's foundations. Or take the author James Baldwin, who urged American society, white and black, to really face the violence that creates these scenarios where America's racist roots are fortified by modern law and policing. Baldwin arguing, you must understand that to see violence in its proper context, be it police brutality or violence by the state or the murders that ended the lives of a generation of leaders, from King to Malcolm X to Medgar Evers to Fred Hampton.
We are still governed by the slave codes. What is called the civil rights movement was really insurrection. So one can say that the latest slave rebellion was brutally put down. We all know what happened to Malcolm. We all know what happened to Martin. We know what happened to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And so many more.
That's a little bit of the history as we watch more history unfold tonight. And this admittedly incomplete report has thus far briefly touched on the economy and the pandemic. Now, as for the police conduct that did set off these wider protests, well, that history's been with us a long time. The repeated use of excessive force and killing, which begins as incidents, but then worse, becomes formally legitimized in a U.S. criminal justice system that allows and defends it. Now, we can report that to you tonight as a fact because the facts show a vast majority of the allegations against police in these instances result in no firings, let alone criminal charges. In the few cases that do lead to a charge, take roughly 15 per year over 10 years. It's about 10 per year of charges of manslaughter or higher. And the convictions for those very rare charges, I can tell you, are even more rare. There's a Bowling Green professor, Philip Stinson. He tracks all on-duty incidents that result in a death with policing. And he found over several years there were literally 0 such convictions in the whole country. If you widen out to a 15-year period of time that he used in his studies, 5 officers in deadly on-duty shootings were convicted of murder. The reason why that's all lopsided on the far right of your screen, and this is so vital to what's happening in America right now, is that 4 of those 5 were convictions from after 2016. So what little change we've seen came after the Black Lives Matter movement and after the spike in cell phone video recordings. Another way to say it, the killing continues. It was rarely ever caught or punished. And the handful of changes I just showed you, they have come at the margins when there is a combination of an extremely incriminating video and public pressure and often, yes, people in the streets. So while no law-abiding citizen is going to support crime or violence, when we stop and listen to the history and listen to those who risk their lives for social change while also advocating peaceful methods for change, tonight, as we look over everything that's happening, I want to tell you it is worth listening to how even they put riots in the context of injustice.
I will continue to condemn riots and continue to say to my brothers and sisters that this is not the way. In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. The unheard. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking about the other America. Can we hear any better? Can we listen any better? That was over 50 years ago. It is a problem that so many of these observations ring so true, so insightfully, and resonate so deeply so many years later. With that brief bit of historical context, we are joined by a scholar, a thinker, an author, Michael Eric Dyson, professor at Georgetown University. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, you've aptly summarized and eloquently articulated the broad sweep of history with a majestic arc, rooted in, first, the acknowledgement that Black suffering in American society has been so deeply entrenched that it is taken for granted. It is the very predicate for American progress. The plantation, then Jim Crow as sharecropping, then separation of society, separation of education, has been the very basis for propelling America forward, white America that is, while Black America is held in captivity. And so the deeply resistive strains of Blackness in this culture that put forth arguments, ideas, and bodies to oppose the vicious and hurtful intensity of white supremacy are seen as exceptions to and not continuations of American democracy. So that Black bodies are alienated from the American scene, Black traditions of resistance are seen as somehow exceptional, and Black life and Black death are seen in a vicious give and take and a cycle trading back and forth. So what we have to do is to acknowledge that this country in which we live has to examine as closely as possible the very roots of its democracy that are intertwined with its own captivity of Black people. But the salvation of America cannot come without the salvation of Black people. What James Baldwin, what Lorraine Hansberry, what Toni Morrison, what Martin Luther King Jr., what Septima Clark understood is that e pluribus unum is more than a credo. It means literally out of many, one. And if you have segregated some, if you have isolated others, you cannot have the full health of American society. Look at the pandemic of COVID-19 and look at the pandemic of COVID-16-19. White supremacy, social injustice, economic inequality joined together to the body. And in both instances, we can't breathe. We can't breathe because of police brutality, and we can't breathe because of a pandemic of COVID-19. This is where the convergence of the natural order and the convergence of our man-made laws have really worked deleteriously to the disadvantage of Black people in this country. Only when we are able to embrace each other across that chasm and tell the truth about the way in which Black death is a fetish. It is the pornography of Black nothingness, of non-being, which is being sought. America is addicted to Black death, and this is part of the problem in American society.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.